In 1995, a shanty boy in the Ottawa Valley burned 7,000 calories a day, swinging an axe in temperatures that froze spit before it hit the ground. If the camp cook could not keep those men fed, the entire operation collapsed. Number 14 on this list was so critical to survival that lumber companies fired cooks who refused to make it. Number 3 created a chemical reaction underground that modern ovens still cannot replicate. These 25 meals kept tens of thousands of Canadian lumberjacks alive through winters that killed the unprepared. But when the last log drives ended and the camps closed, every one of these suppers vanished from Canadian tables. Before we start, hit that subscribe button, because what these men ate to survive minus 40 degrees Celsius might change the way you think about food. Let us count them down. Number 25, fried salt pork and bread. Before anything fancy hit the table, there was salt pork. Thick slabs of it, crusted in coarse salt and shipped in barrels from Montreal up the Ottawa River. The cook would slice it thin, drop it into a screaming hot cast iron pan, and fry until the edges curled crisp and golden. The rendered fat pooled in the pan, and that was the gravy. Shanty boys soaked hunks of bread in the drippings, sometimes adding nothing more than a shake of pepper. A barrel of salt pork cost about $4 in the 1880s and could feed a crew of 40 for a week. In temperatures that dropped to minus 35, a man's body burned through calories like a stove burned through cordwood. Without that layer of grease coating his stomach before dawn, a lumberjack could not last until the midday meal. Salt pork on bread was not a meal anyone loved. It was a meal that kept men standing upright in the bush. Number 24, boiled oatmeal porridge. Before the first hint of gray light touched the timber, the cook had porridge bubbling in a pot the size of a wash tub. Coarse steel-cut oats, shipped north in 100-pound sacks, were boiled in water with a fistful of salt until thick enough to hold a spoon upright. No sugar, no cream. Maybe a splash of molasses if the cook was generous. A pound of oats cost about 2 cents in the 1890s, making porridge the cheapest meal in camp. The men ate standing or crouched on benches, shoveling it down in silence. That bowl of gray, steaming porridge sat like cement in the stomach, which was exactly the point. It released energy slowly through a morning of crosscut sawing in waist-deep snow. The shanty boys just called it gut filler. Number 23, boiled beef and cabbage. When a side of beef made it to camp, usually frozen solid on a toboggan pulled by horses, the cook would hack off chunks with a hand axe and boil them for hours with cabbage and root vegetables. Carrots, turnips, and onions filled the pot. The smell divided opinion. Some men claimed it was the finest thing they had eaten after 10 hours in the cold. Others said it reminded them of the bunkhouse. Either way, every drop was consumed. Wasting food in a logging camp was treated almost as seriously as losing an axe. The cook stretched a single side of beef across 3 days of meals for 50 men, boiling the bones for stock long after the last scrap of meat had been picked clean. Number 22, molasses on bread. When the butter ran out, and it always ran out by late January, molasses became the spread for everything. Blackstrap, molasses, thick and dark as creosote, was poured over slabs of sourdough bread still warm from the oven. A gallon jug sat at the center of every table in every camp, from New Brunswick to British Columbia. At 2 meals a day, a crew of 40 could go through a gallon in 3 days. The sweetness cut through the monotony of salt pork and beans, giving men something to look forward to when the menu had not changed in 6 weeks. Camp records from the Gatineau Valley in 1903 show that lumber companies ordered molasses by the barrel, sometimes 50 gallons at a time, shipped upriver before freeze-up. When the molasses ran low, morale dropped faster than the temperature. A cook who let the molasses barrel go empty did not last long. Number 21, Johnny Cake. Cornmeal mixed with water, salt, and a spoonful of lard, baked flat on a greased iron sheet near the open fire. It showed up in camps across Ontario and Quebec wherever wheat flour ran short. It baked fast, 15 minutes at most, and could be carried in a coat pocket without falling apart. Men ate it cold at the cutting site, sometimes crumbled into a cup of hot tea to make a thick paste that warmed the gut. The texture was dense and crumbly, nothing like modern cornbread. But at minus 40 degrees Celsius, heavy was a feature, not a flaw. Johnny Cake vanished from camp tables when rail lines made wheat flour cheap and reliable. Number 20. Stewed prunes. Every logging camp in Canada kept barrels of dried prunes in the storehouse. The cook would simmer them for hours until soft and syrupy, then serve them at breakfast alongside porridge or at supper as the closest thing to dessert the men would see for months. Prunes solved a problem nobody talked about openly. A diet of salt pork, beans, and bread with almost no fresh vegetables created severe digestive trouble. Stewed prunes kept things moving. A 50-pound crate cost about $3 in 1890 and lasted a month. The men did not love them, but they ate them because the alternative was worse. Camps near rivers and lakes added baked fish to the rotation whenever the catch allowed. Lake trout, walleye, pike, and whitefish were pulled through holes cut in the ice and baked whole in the camp oven, stuffed with onions and salt. A single lake trout from northern Ontario could weigh 20 pounds, enough to feed a dozen men as a side dish. The cook would score the skin, rub it with lard, and bake it on an iron sheet until the flesh flaked white and clean. Fish was the only fresh protein some camps saw between November and April. The change from salt pork was so welcome that oral histories from camps near Lake Temiskaming recall men cheering when the cook announced fish for supper. As camps moved deeper into the interior, away from navigable water, baked fish became rarer. Its absence marked the difference between a good posting and a miserable one. Number 18. Pork and beans fried. Not baked, not boiled, but fried. When leftover baked beans sat overnight and stiffened into a solid mass, the cook would slice the cold block into thick slabs and fry them in pork fat until a dark brown crust formed on both sides. The result was crispy on the outside, creamy on the inside, and so dense with calories that a single slab could carry a man through a morning of bucking logs. This was the original camp leftovers meal. Nothing was thrown away. Cold beans from supper became fried bean cakes for breakfast, served alongside salt pork and bread. Men who worked the camps in the 1920s recalled the smell of frying beans hitting them before they even opened the bunkhouse door. Number 17. Wild game stew. When a moose or deer wandered near camp and hunting was allowed by the foreman, the cook had fresh meat for the first time in weeks. The animal was gutted, hung from a crossbeam, and butchered in the cold. Tough cuts went straight into the stew pot with potatoes, onions, and whatever root vegetables remained. Moose meat simmered for hours, the broth turning dark and rich with rendered fat. In camps across northern Ontario and Quebec, wild game could make the difference between a crew that stayed through the season and one that walked out. A single bull moose dressed out at over 500 pounds of usable meat, enough to supplement rations for weeks. The cook hung the quarters outside where they froze solid in the open air. The Canadian winter was the only refrigerator the camp needed. Number 16. Sourdough bread. The sourdough starter was the most valuable thing in the cookhouse, worth more than the stove itself. The cook kept a crock of living starter near the heat at all times, feeding it flour and water daily so it never died. From that bubbling, sour-smelling paste came loaves of bread that fed 50 men 3 times a day. A good camp cook baked between 12 and 20 loaves daily, pulling them golden and steaming from the oven before dawn. The bread had a thick, chewy crust and a tangy, dense crumb that could soak up a bowl of bean broth without falling apart. Men tore off hunks and stuffed them into coat pockets for the midday meal. That starter sometimes traveled with a cook from camp to camp for years, carried in a sealed jar like a living heirloom. When a starter died from cold or neglect, the cook had to beg one from a neighboring camp, and the shame of it followed him the rest of the season. First, Pattern break. Here is where things get interesting. The camp cook was the second most important man in the operation, right behind the foreman. Lumber companies in the Ottawa Valley paid cooks double what they paid cutters, sometimes $45 a month, when a shanty boy earned $20. A cook rose at 3 in the morning and did not stop until 9 at night. He managed a cookie, sometimes 2, and fed 40 to 60 men 3 massive meals a day in a kitchen no bigger than a modern bedroom. The stove burned constantly. Bread dough was rising, while beans were baking, while salt pork was frying. If a cook failed, if the food was bad or the portions short, men walked out. And a crew that walked out in January meant thousands of dollars in lost timber. The best cooks had reputations that spread across the valley, and shanty boys chose camps based on who was cooking, not who was paying. Number 15. Strong black tea. Not coffee. Tea. Gallons of it. Brewed in a pot the size of a bucket and served scalding hot at every meal. The cook kept that pot on the stove from 3 in the morning until lights out, adding fresh leaves on top of old ones until the brew turned dark as river water after a spring flood. Men drank it with sugar or molasses, never milk. Tea warmed frozen hands, cut the grease of a salt pork meal, and gave men the jolt they needed for another 10 hours in the cold. Coffee was an American habit. In Canadian camps, tea was king. Number 14. Boiled salt pork dinner. The full boiled dinner was the Sunday supper of the logging camp. A massive slab of salt pork, soaked overnight to draw out the brine, was then boiled for hours with whole potatoes, turnips, carrots, and a head of cabbage quartered into the pot. Everything cooked in a single cauldron, the vegetables absorbing the smoky pork flavor until every bite tasted of meat, even when it was only turnip. This was the one meal where portions were generous without complaint. The broth left behind was saved for Monday's soup. The bones went to stock, the fat was stored for frying. From a single piece of salt pork, the cook extracted 3 days of flavor. That was survival arithmetic, feeding men when the nearest town was 50 miles of frozen trail away. Number 13. Biscuits and lard. When bread ran short between baking days, the cook made biscuits. Flour, baking powder, salt, and a generous spoonful of lard, mixed fast, cut thick, and baked hot. A batch of 40 took 20 minutes from bowl to table. The lard made them flaky and rich, dense enough to carry in a pocket without crumbling. Men split them open and filled them with salt pork or spread them with molasses. The cook, who could make a light biscuit in a wood-fired oven that ran 20 degrees hotter on one side than the other, was considered an artist. Number 12. Habitant pea soup. Soupe aux pois. The soul of the French-Canadian logging camp. Whole yellow peas were soaked overnight, then simmered all day with a chunk of salt pork, onions, and a pinch of summer savory. By supper time, the peas had broken down into a thick golden broth that clung to the spoon and warmed a man from the inside out. In Quebec camps, pea soup was served every single day without exception. A 100-pound sack of dried peas cost about $2 and fed a crew for 2 weeks. French-Canadian cooks guarded their pea soup recipes the way other men guarded their wages. The perfect pea soup stood just barely on the edge of pourable. Habitant pea soup survived the camps and became a national staple. But the original, made over a wood fire in a blackened cast iron pot, tasted different from anything that came after. Number 11. Donuts. The camp donut was not the glazed ring you find at Tim Hortons. It was a fist-sized ball of sweetened dough, dropped into a vat of boiling lard and fried until the outside turned deep brown and the inside stayed soft. A single cook could produce 300 in an afternoon, and a crew of 50 would finish them by morning. They were portable, calorie-dense, and sweet enough to break the monotony of salt and grease. The cook who made good donuts kept his crew happy. The cook who ran out of sugar faced a bunkhouse full of men with nothing sweet to look forward to until the next supply run, 3 weeks away. Number 10. Dried apple pie. Apples did not survive the journey into camp, but dried apples packed tight in wooden crates kept all winter. The cook soaked them overnight, stewed them with sugar and cinnamon, and poured the filling into a pastry crust made with lard. The shanty boys called it pregnant woman's pie because the dried apples swelled up enormously when they rehydrated. A single pie served 8 men. It was cut into thick wedges and eaten without plates, held in bare hands still red from the cold. Pie was the measure of a cook's skill. Any man could boil beans. But a flaky crust, baked in a wood-fired oven that ran at inconsistent temperatures, took real talent. Dried apple pie disappeared when fresh fruit became available year-round. But for the men who ate it by lantern light in a shanty that smelled of pine smoke, nothing since has come close. Second, pattern break. The bunkhouse rule of silence at meals was not about discipline. It was about speed. The cook had 15 minutes to feed 50 men 3 times a day. If men talked, they ate slower. If they ate slower, they reached the cutting site late. If they reached the cutting site late, the company lost timber. So the foreman enforced silence like a law. Men who spoke were warned once. Men who spoke twice were docked pay. The only sound in the cookhouse was the scrape of tin forks on tin plates, the slurp of hot tea, and the thud of the cook's ladle hitting the bottom of the pot. You learned fast that in a logging camp, food was fuel, not fellowship. You ate it the same way you swung an axe, hard, fast, and without wasting a single stroke. Number 9, vinegar pie. When lemons were impossible and fresh fruit was a memory, the camp cook made vinegar pie. Apple cider, vinegar, sugar, butter, eggs, flour, and a dash of nutmeg baked in a lard crust. The vinegar created a tartness that mimicked lemon, giving the men something bright and sharp in a diet dominated by salt and smoke. The filling set into a smooth, custardy layer, golden and trembling. It sounds terrible. It tasted remarkable. A single pie cost almost nothing to make and used only pantry staples already in the storehouse. Vinegar pie vanished completely when cheap canned fruit made it unnecessary. Today, almost no one under 60 has heard of it. Number 8, bannock. Indigenous peoples had been making bannock for generations before it became a logging camp staple. Flour, water, baking powder, and a pinch of salt were mixed into a stiff dough, then cooked directly on a hot stone beside the fire or fried in pork fat in a skillet. In camps where ovens broke down or supply wagons failed to arrive, bannock kept men fed. A skilled cook could produce enough for 50 men in under an hour with nothing but a sack of flour and a fire. It tore apart into dense, chewy strips that held up in stew broth or stood alone as the entire midday meal. Men on the river drive carried flat cakes of bannock in their coat pockets, eating them cold while standing knee-deep in freezing water, guiding logs past jams. Bannock asked nothing of the cook except flour and heat. Its simplicity was its genius. Number 7, boiled rice pudding. When the cook had rice, milk, sugar, and eggs on hand, rice pudding appeared at supper and the entire mood of the camp shifted. A massive pan of it, baked until the top turned golden brown and the inside went creamy and soft, was the closest thing to home most shanty boys tasted between October and April. The cook sweetened it with brown sugar or molasses, sometimes adding raisins if the supply wagon had been kind. Men who had eaten beans 3 times that day ate 2 bowls without stopping. It was comfort in a tin dish. Warmth without salt. Sweetness without apology. Rice pudding was never the main course. It was the reward. And in a camp where rewards were few, it mattered more than the men would admit. Number 6, corned beef hash. Tinned corned beef arrived in Canadian camps in the early 1900s, packed in cases and shipped by rail to the end of the line, then by horse and toboggan into the bush. The cook would open a dozen tins, dice the dense pink meat, fry it with potatoes and onions and pork fat, and serve it sizzling in the skillet. The sharp metallic tang was unmistakable, but fried hot with enough onion and pepper, it became something the men actually looked forward to. Corned beef hash was the cook's emergency meal. When fresh meat ran out, when the game had moved on, when the supply wagon was overdue, those sealed tins kept the operation running. The men did not romanticize it. They ate it because it was there and because the alternative was another bowl of beans. Number 5, molasses cookies. Cookies the size of dinner plates, thick and chewy, dark with molasses, and spiced with ginger. The camp cook baked them by the hundreds, stacking them in wooden boxes that sat open on the table at every meal. Men grabbed 3 or 4 at a time, stuffing them into pockets for the long hours between meals in the bush. The molasses kept them soft for days, even in sub-zero temperatures, unlike bread, which froze solid by mid-morning. A batch of 100 cookies required only flour, molasses, lard, ginger, and baking soda. These were not delicate things. They were thick, dense fuel discs designed to deliver sugar and fat to a body burning 7,000 calories a day. The smell of molasses cookies baking was the one smell in camp that made every man stop and remember that somewhere, far from the frozen bush, someone's kitchen smelled exactly the same. Number 4, tourtière. In French-Canadian camps across Quebec, the cook made tourtière for Christmas Eve and sometimes for New Year. A double-crusted meat pie filled with ground pork, sometimes mixed with veal or game meat, and seasoned with cloves, cinnamon, and black pepper. The pastry was made with lard, rolled thin, and baked until the crust turned flaky and golden. A single tourtière served 8 men. The cook would make a dozen for the holiday meal. That Christmas supper was the only time all season when the rule of silence was relaxed. Men talked, men laughed, some sang. The tourtière was passed hand to hand, still warm, and for one meal, the camp felt like something close to home. Tourtière was not everyday food. It was the one meal that reminded a man why he was out there in the cold, to earn enough to put food like this on his own family's table. Number 3, bean-hole baked beans. The most important single food in the history of Canadian logging. Every camp had a bean hole, a pit dug in the frozen ground, lined with stones, and sheltered by a lean-to. Every morning, the cookie would build a fire in the pit, parboil a batch of soaked beans, then layer them in a cast iron kettle with slabs of salt pork, sliced onions, dry mustard, and a long pour of blackstrap molasses. The lid went on tight. The kettle went into the pit. Hot coals were shoveled around and over it. Dirt was packed on top. The beans were left to bake underground for 12 to 16 hours. The slow, even heat of the buried coals created something no oven could match. The beans emerged the next morning, dark and glossy, each one tender and saturated with smoky, sweet pork flavor. Studies from the University of Maine measured that each man consumed between 1 and 1.5 pounds of baked beans per day, providing up to a third of his daily protein. Bean-whole beans were served at breakfast and supper without fail, the heartbeat of the camp diet from October to April. When the camps closed, the bean holes were abandoned and the recipe went with the cooks who carried it in their heads, never written down. This method of underground baking was learned from indigenous peoples and perfected over a century of bush cooking. Nothing in a modern kitchen replicates it. Number 2, shanty supper stew. The evening stew was the cook's masterpiece, a cauldron of everything the camp had simmered together for hours over a constant fire. Salt pork or beef, potatoes, onions, turnips, carrots, cabbage, barley, and whatever dried herbs the cook kept in his private stores. This was the meal that brought men back to the cookhouse after a day that started before dawn and ended after dark. The stew pot never fully emptied. Like the pea soup, it was topped up and kept going, each batch building on the flavor of the last. By February, that pot had absorbed months of slow-cooked history, each ladle carrying the ghost of every meal before it. Men ate in silence, bowls held close to the chest, steam rising into the yellow lantern light. For many, that first hot mouthful after a frozen day in the bush was the single best moment of a lumberjack's life. Number 1, the full camp supper spread. On the best nights in the best camps, the cook laid out a table that would stun anyone who imagined lumberjacks living on scraps. Roast beef or pork, baked beans, boiled potatoes, mashed turnips, sourdough bread still warm from the oven, pickles, stewed prunes, molasses cookies, pie, donuts, and pots of tea strong enough to strip varnish. 50 men sat shoulder to shoulder on plank benches, eating in disciplined silence, cleaning every plate in 15 minutes flat. 7,000 calories a day demanded nothing less. The cook and his cookie had been working since 3 in the morning to produce this spread, and they would work until 9 preparing tomorrow's bread and beans. This was the forgotten feast of the Canadian bush, a meal born of brutal necessity, built on salt pork and molasses and sheer will, served in a log building in the middle of a frozen nowhere to men who would be back at the cutting face before sunrise. No restaurant serves it, no cookbook preserves it. The full camp supper existed only in the memory of men who swung axes for a living and in the hands of cooks who never wrote a single recipe down. When the last camps closed, the last suppers went with them, and a century of Canadian kitchen knowledge vanished into the snow. Try telling your grandparents about any one of these. If they grew up in timber country, in the Ottawa Valley, on the north shore of Lake Superior, in the Miramichi or the Gatineau, they will know. Share which supper surprised you most in the comments. And if your family has a logging camp recipe that survived, write it down before it disappears for good.